Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode number 467. We have Brian Berry, our special guest, back today to talk about one. He talked to us a month or so back about sort of OneStream's journey to Azure. Now we're going to talk about sort of what OneStream looks like in the future on Azure, sort of what their architecture and a cloud native role looks like. Joined by Sajid DeMello, we're recording this on July 11th, and this is episode number 467. So Sajid, looks like you put some notes out there. What do you want to talk about today?
Yeah, a couple of quick ones here. One which caught me by surprise. I didn't realize we were renaming Azure AD, but it is now Microsoft Entra ID. Not, not a fan of the name, but it is what it is. Entra ID. Uh, MEID. I don't know how they're going to shorten that. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's Microsoft Entra, ENTRA, Entra ID. So that's a new name. Everything else remains the same. It's just a name change. So I guess we just have to get used to calling it that in future because we're so used to calling it AD.
Yep,
You know.
yep,
So
yep.
that's one. And the other one was an update for Azure Monitor logs, being able to ingest logs directly from event hubs, right? And this is a very common use case. A lot of companies, and I've done this in the past with other customers, where we just, dumped a lot of telemetry we used to get from routers and everything, put them into an event log, event hub. I mean, and then you write something, take them and put them into like Azure Monitor logs or log analytics or whatever. Now that's automatic. You can just point it to, and it'll just take all the logs, all the entries from Event Hub and put them into the logs directly. This way you don't have to write any special code for that.
Nice. Yeah, along the same lines, one of the ones that I wanted to point out was, and I actually didn't know you could do this at all with Azure Data Explorer. But it's actually really cool. So you can now they call them external tables, but you can basically create a table in Azure Data Explorer that is pointing to SQL Server, and that's been around for a little while. And we've added PostgreSQL, MySQL, and Cosmos. And obviously, you can't change the data and do inserts and like you could if you were using the relational side of this, but you can run queries against it just like it's a Data Explorer table, right? It's sort of the old linked server construct from the on-premises SQL Server world. But I thought that was really cool. Definitely, there's lots of data that doesn't all live in Data Explorer, right? It's nice to be able to access it. The other two sort of networking related. The first is the cross-region load balancer is generally available. So this, historically you've had to say, hey, I've got a load balancer in region A, and all my resources are in region A as well. Now you can put your load balancer wherever you want, and you can direct it to resources wherever you want globally. So you have a lot more flexibility there. Sort of starts getting into the traffic manager world a little bit, right, conceptually, but gives you a lot of flexibility. And then the other one, and I sort of laughed at this one because I remember early on, people were asking for this, and it's sort of in some ways tells, we're sort of going back to the on-premises capabilities, but Azure Virtual Network Encryption is now available, right? So all the traffic is encapsulated. It's all not really easily visible at the infrastructure layer, but theoretically, if you get a network capture inside the data center, right, you could undo the decapsulation and you could see what's in there. Now customers can actually encrypt traffic between VM to VM traffic within a VNet at that point. And so, or I'm sorry, basically would be all the traffic for the VMs in that VNet. And again, that's adding on TLS on top of all the encapsulation and all of the compartmentalization that we do from all that traffic. So again, isn't something everybody needs for sure, but it's definitely if you're running super sensitive workloads where, just like you have encryption at rest, type things, right? This is a feature you're going to probably want to take advantage of.
That's interesting. Mind if I ask a question about that? Like, how does that vary? Like, if you were using TLS already on your own workloads, is that really adding
I was
additional?
wondering
Yeah,
about the same thing.
So it's not if you're using TLS, right, in your workload, but you think about there's a lot of communications these days that are still done in the clear, right? And the problem with doing TLS, right, is you basically the server and the client have to support, the protocol has to support it natively, and sometimes you have to make code changes to make it work. But this way, theoretically, you could take code that doesn't have it and you just turn it on the VNet, and everything would be encrypted at that point. Again, it won't really see it, from the VM's perspective, it won't look like it's encrypted, right? But if I look at it, it basically it's going to get encrypted as you go down the virtual stack, right? But if I was to take, again, a network trace in the data center, it's just encrypted traffic at
So
the top of the
that's
encapsulation stack.
that actually creates some interesting scenarios, because one thing that really comes to mind, and actually it's a problem even for us, is when you think about needing wildcard certs for doing
Yep.
TLS, and then
Yep.
it gets invariably you have load balancers that tend to
It's
offload that,
complicated.
and then
Yep. Yep.
you end up with these small segments that traffic is unencrypted, and this
Yep.
seems like a checkbox that could
Yeah.
solve that.
I think that's the vision for this, right?
Yeah.
We had customers as they were coming on sort of saying, hey, again, this is why I sort of reference the encryption at rest,
Yeah.
thought process, which is there's customers say, yeah, I get it, Microsoft, nobody can touch these things. You're only allowed to, access stuff within certain, scenarios, and the data itself is encrypted in, sort of when you're using it. But there are all kinds of regulatory worlds where this stuff needs to be encrypted 6 ways to Sunday, and this is just another layer that you can add on top of that, or maybe simplify your infrastructure, right, from your configuration, your management part. Like managing wildcard certificates is not easy if you're not familiar with it. It's not something you're used to. Now you can say, hey, I just turn it on and it's encrypted, and I don't have to manage the certificates if you don't, absolutely need it based on the protocol.
Interesting.
Yeah, neat. So cool. So with that, so Ryan, you sort of jumped in there, but if you would, reintroduce yourself, because some people may not have caught the previous episode, and tell us who OneStream is and what you do at OneStream.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan Berry, Senior Vice President of Architecture, and basically what my team is responsible for. I've got multiple factions of teams. I've got one that owns all of our DevOps operations and our engineering organization, but my primary architecture team is focused on exploring ways to use and leverage and capitalize on cloud native capabilities that we can incorporate into our platform to be able to light up additional features more quickly than we would have otherwise had to incur engineering time to build ourselves, to delight our customers. And who are our customers? We're in the financial corporate consolidation space. So good way to think about that is think the largest of the publicly traded organizations. When it comes to them needing to report their earnings to Wall Street, they need tooling like us to be able to take all of their consolidated financial, or to produce their consolidated financial statements. And that involves taking data from a plethora of systems, and think about all the complexities when it comes to downstream subsidiaries that are partially owned, all of those complexities and nuances that the office of CFO has to deal with. Our platform can help a customer facilitate that.
Okay, great. Yeah, and the reason we had you on to talk earlier about sort of your journey to the cloud, but I think I think you mentioned this in the show. You definitely mentioned this to me when you and I were talking. But your architecture functionally is an on-premises architecture that you brought to Azure. You made some updates and some modifications for it, but it still is mostly sort of that on-premises architecture, a lift and shift type approach. But that's not where you're going to stay down the road, and that absolutely, to your point, slows you down. What are y'all looking at? Are you looking at containers? Are you looking at app services? Like what services are y'all looking at leveraging?
Yeah, so excellent question. And our workload needs a lot of computational power and RAM. And why that's significant and noteworthy is that services like app services we're kind of precluded from being able to take advantage of some of those at scale with or in a multi-tenancy manner, because you think of the a typical, some of our larger customers have VMs that are 32 cores, half a terabyte plus of RAM.
Yeah, these are big.
Yeah. So that kind of starts excluding a lot of cloud services that are more commoditized for microservice type level interactions. So that is a constraining artifact of how we what our software needs today. So as such, we're exploring a couple of different options, and I say a couple because it's going to we're going to have kind of a phase one Today we use a lot of IaaS infrastructure, but then how can we improve upon that? And one thing that we can do, obviously we have a lot of automation in place to produce and build and deploy those VMs. However, when it comes to patching them, we need
we
to
talked
have
about that last
automation
time.
in
It's
place
non-trivial.
to be able to facilitate that. So how can we improve that? And actually, this has been a long-standing capability of Azure. We just haven't been able to capitalize on it. Is VM scale sets, in having the engineering organization produce an image that can then be consumed and by our operations team to that contains all the artifacts needed to make our software function, and then it makes for a very easy vehicle for our operations team to deploy that new version of product to a customer. And I think I mentioned this previously, that we have an interesting nuance that because of the business that we're in, as a SaaS provider, we're unique in that we actually have to version our platform, because as auditors who come in and evaluate the earnings that a company reports, and it has to correspond to some traceable version of a platform used to produce those numbers. So that kind of makes things a little bit challenging for us in a typical SaaS provider, that we do actually have a version. So the idea is that we can actually use VM scale sets to be able to ship an image. But then how does that work going forward? Our go forward vision is to make use of more container based solutions, a lot in Azure Container Services, and Kubernetes. So this use of VM scale set images is a sort of a training wheels opportunity for the engineering and DevOps organization to produce artifacts that are then handed over to our operations team. And that same sort of thing will happen in the Kubernetes world. It just won't be a VM, a heavy-handed VM image. It's just going to be a container image. So it's a way to be able to progress towards a more succinct and concise deployment modality for our platform.
And very DevOps friendly at the end of the day as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Ryan, anytime you take like something that's a monolith and try to break it down, it's always a challenge, especially if you're running production system. Is do you break it down a little bit at a time and keep the system running? In other words, you abstract out pieces at a time but keep it running, or do you just wait for the entire thing to be deconstructed and then move over to the new platform? I'm just wondering like what kind of approach you're taking there.
And that's a really good question. And because we have a complicated piece of software that has a lot of innovations over well over a decade of time, we can't start over. Like that would be such a long, such a gigantic project, that it would take years to deliver on that. So we have to perform while we transform, so to speak. So they're in having a platform that has grown organically to the level of complexity is at today. We've taken advantage of we're still on top of .NET framework, so just using that as a simple talking point. It's a Herculean effort just to get to a point where we could run in .NET Core to get away from Windows operating system and have a smaller container image. So we're looking at those types of vectors about what can we do to kind of modernize some of the underpinnings, and then as we advance forward, that we can start looking at how can we start peeling out services that that might be beneficial to our customers as well as us, to peel out maybe things that could be shared in a multi-tenancy fashion that can be scaled up independent of a customer environment, allowing customers to benefit from additive performance, as well as us to be able to benefit from simpler deployment models. But today we kind of have to deal with these constraining guidelines that our customers have imposed on us, and quite honestly, the financial regulations have imposed upon us, that where we have these isolated environments, and so with that lens, we're just trying to optimize for using newer technologies that are easier and more quickly to or more able to take advantage of Linux environments and Kubernetes and that sort of thing, and then we'll evaluate things as we go along from there, but. And that's the approach we're taking.
It's always hard when you have an existing one, right? Because you can't, you're never going to have full parity, right, between old and new. So the application side that you were talking about, right? Sort of the maybe the middle tier, or I don't know. These days we don't really talk about a 3-tier architecture, but the non-database stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like it's generally pretty easy to start carving out, an API here or an API there, right? And moving that over to containers. What are you thinking about on the database side? Because y'all do a bunch of processing in the database. Like the database itself
Yeah.
is a heavy part of that computational piece.
Absolutely.
And it's databases are memory and storage and compute hungry, right? They will take as much as you give them. So what kind of ideas are you sort of talking through as options there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, it's really no surprise, the industry talks about this all over, but there's just this explosive element of data growth when and
Hmm.
companies and our customers alike are wanting to do more, and make more sense of that data, be able to have more informed, make it better and more informed decisions from that data. So as such, they want to retain it, which kind of causes a compounding
Yep.
problem when you start asking a lot for like a traditional relational store. So, what that means for us is that, we're exploring other storage modalities,
Okay.
and I say other because it might not be just one. Actually, it
Yep.
most likely will not be just one. Maybe Azure Data Explorer makes sense for a subset of data that that customers are using in a feature of our product. Maybe we could just simply use blob storage for with Parquet files for another area. So that's these are the types of realities that we're working in, and we're also AI is a very hot topic in the industry, and we're trying to be cognizant and aware of decisions we make on storage platforms and what sorts of capabilities can be layered on top of that to be able to
Right.
allow our customers to ask questions of that data. So those are some driving factors behind thinking about what sort of services we use. And then there's another element of, I don't want to say concern, but a consideration, maybe would be a better way to phrase it. And you have and that obviously all these any cloud service has a cost element to it. And when if today a relational store is pretty easy to deploy in a per customer deployment modality. But some of these other services aren't really well suited for being able to accommodate that. So you have to think about the security implications and cost implications about having a multi-tenant approach for some of those services. So that's a really big factor that we have to kind of consider as well. And then the whole litany of things that go along with that when it comes to DR and HA, like ADX is a good example. Like how do you, what's the DR story for that to be able to, copy that data into another region and make it available should it be. So those are all considering factors, but the short of to kind of be succinct and direct to the question you asked is that very much I think that in a cloud or SaaS world that I'm a firm believer of a polyglot type architecture where you
Yeah.
have lots of different storage in modalities depending on the type and nature of data.
So I suspect that, not necessarily saying that y'all are going to go this way, but
Yeah.
products like the new Microsoft Fabric that we announced, right, where it's using Parquet as the base
Yeah.
format across multiple, services. I think like, Synapse and all the other services are going to be able to, sort of treat Parquet as a standard common format. Like you're probably going to be in that kind of thinking, that
Correct.
kind of world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but we've been paying attention to some of those announcements, and very much plugged in with our Microsoft team and understanding the impact and implications they have and some of the decisions we're making. But so yes, those are very interesting to us. When it comes to the shared compute that kind of
Yep.
exists behind some of those services, and actually, quite honestly, making it simpler for
Yeah.
companies like us to be able to consume those services from a compute standpoint.
Yeah, because I was thinking about that as you were talking about a polyglot world, right? The upside to the polyglot world is your data can sit where it's going to sit, and you can sort of consume different data formats. The downside is you have to manage that,
Yeah.
and you have to configure it, set it up, make sure it's performant, and at some level, although there are definitely downsides to one big massive SQL Server engine somewhere, there's upsides to it in terms of you only have that to manage, right? You don't have all these different pieces, and you're going to pick up all these different pieces. How does you were mentioning earlier that one of the areas that you have accountability for is the DevOps part of your infrastructure. the DevOps and containers go like those things are super tightly wedded. Is some of what you're looking at the evolution of what you can do with DevOps by moving to that world? I mean, because DevOps will work with IaaS. It's not as clean and crisp as it is with containers.
No, absolutely, and you are spot on. There's some being historically having roots in the on-premises world. You have installers and such that our engineering team is used to producing and testing and validating. So and we'll continue to do so for some time. But why that's interesting and worth mentioning on the DevOps side is that historically it's just been a matter of having build automation that can produce those artifacts, and then they get handed over to somebody else and that somebody else is has the special keys of the kingdom and can provision images in the production world and such. So the lines tend to start blurring when you start modernizing. And I mentioned the training wheels of using VM scale sets, like as a very real scenario in which we're trying to where the lines are blurring between the engineering organization delivering binaries and innovations our customers are leveraging, and then the team that's responsible for owning and managing, maintaining, operating that. And that's a good way to kind of hand that off, is that no longer for those cloud customers, we wouldn't be producing an installer artifact, we'd be producing an image artifact. And that image is going to be tuned and hardened by the engineering organization, and then the operations team is going to take that and run with it. So and the same holds true in the Kubernetes world. So there's a level of integration, I think, that needs to happen for organizations to be successful in crossing that chasm.
Yeah, it's like a lot of the stuff that we see in application modernization. The hill to climb is not easy at times, right? It is no question an engineering and a technical challenge to go from a monolithic IaaS based lift and shift architecture to a modern one, but the payoff is there when you get there, and so it's generally worth that climb. But it does take time to get there, and I suspect your team is sort of on that climb, and some days are better than others, and some lessons are sort of learned the hard way. Are there lessons that you would sort of impart to somebody who's getting ready to start that journey, that you say, hey, we did this thing, and don't ever do this. This was we shouldn't have jumped that far to start with, or something. Any good sort of looking back lessons?
Yeah, so I covered a little bit of them, and I think it's a good, maybe worth double clicking on it, because I think that had we thrown out everything and started all over, that might have been maybe the architecturally correct thing to do that will look really clean on a whiteboard, but it would have been an impossibility, for a high growth startup to survive doing that in parallel while innovating on an existing code base. And how do you tie the two together?
You basically double your code bases.
Exactly. So I think from my point of view, that the crawl, walk, run approach is important. And I know, and I use example, and I certainly understand VM scale sets have been around a long time, and feel embarrassed that that wasn't something we weren't able to take advantage of just because of how we did things previously. But using that as like a simple talking point, like that we realize that's very similar construct to what our next stage is, and that's an easy stepping stone that we could actually go, that we could use to cross a bridge. There's some other interesting things that have emerged with regards to, because when you make the, VM scale sets is still largely IaaS, you still largely can have per customer environments. But then when you go to Kubernetes, there's a big paradigm shift into, even if you have per customer containers or pods, you still have multi-tenancy on the infrastructure
at that sort of the cluster level, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that becomes really interesting on the observability layer. So when it comes to monitoring, and it has implications on support and our procedures we have in place to be able to inhibit support and operations access to customer environments. There has to be some material changes to some of those things and how they We still have to obviously, lock down the actual data from any, potential bad actor, but the way you do so is very different, and particularly the observability frame or lens becomes much different when you're not looking at it per customer. When you're looking at it, from all up, which actually is going to be a huge benefit, quite frankly, with our operations team, and because they can see everything all at once. But it's also going to be, we have to make sure we go about that correctly, and that we're things that that we're adhering and abiding by our privacy policies and things that we have in place to govern, or that we promise to our customers, and that's a challenging journey. It's easy to say, just install XYZ thing and you can watch it. Yeah, you can do that, but there's some what about if I'll use a simple example. So the GDPR is important and relevant to any global company. So what if you capture error messages and from a SaaS platform, that's relatively benign. What if said error message is an exception about you logging in? Now we have with your email address in it. And that's an accidental data exposure. What happens then? How do you treat it? And you have all these things like that you have to kind of tease out. And sometimes you have to pump the brakes a little bit, and which is, you can't move as maybe fast as you'd like to move because of some of those constraints. But those are all real problems you have to address before you just jump into that new cloud world.
I feel like you're probably going to end up being on a journey that some of our internal teams here at Microsoft have been on, which is they end up going the what do we call it? We call it the multi-tenant code on single tenant infrastructure. Right. So you're basically running this, so you start IaaS and then you refactor your code. Okay. Now the code can do multi-tenant, but you're not quite ready to run in a shared environment. And so, because you still haven't figured out some of your data privacy things, some of the logging things you got to figure out. But you're sort of getting there in stages, right? Rather than having to make that big jump. Like, it feels like y'all probably be somewhere along that journey at some point.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. Those are all considering factors as we start looking into the future, and kind of what what things, if at all, we want to support on-prem, and kind of making those sorts of decision factors. Which
that's right, because you can't walk away from your on-premises business either, so you still need to keep that. Exactly. That's a good point.
So we have to kind of make some decisions at some point about kind of what that looks like. And I mentioned all the data storage capabilities. There might be things that just might be excluded from some of those types of customers, and at some point there might need to other decisions might need to be made. But but those are all from an engineering standpoint, all things we have to kind of take into account when we're putting pen to paper on, what is this thing going to do? What is the future of said thing? What is the future of customers, using said thing? Where are they going to sit? And all of those are factors we have to kind of take into account. And then also, to your point, how are we going to deploy this thing? Is this going to be shared? Is this going to be, is this a capability that has to remain isolated because of, the nature of our business?
I feel like listening to you talk that I could just sort of pencil you in about once a year, every year for the next 5 years, and you show back up. Oh, okay, we made this piece, we managed to make it sort of cloud native,
exactly,
and everything else. No, this is great. I mean, this is a great, great to sort of hear the customer side of this story, right? Because on the Microsoft side, we're able to just go do it. And again, I say that with a little bit tongue in cheek, because we know that the reality is not always as easy as sort of the marketing. But it's really easy to say, oh, just go cloud native, go to containers. But the reality is, you have a business that you have to run, you have to make money, you have to pay people's paychecks, right? You have to have that. So any last thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
No, I think that there's a lot. One thing that always comes up is in conversations as we're exploring new capabilities, the whole adage of build versus buy, and I think the one thing that would be important, considering factors, particularly in the I mentioned AI just briefly, and just using that as a launch pad, that's services like that. That there are innovations that you, Microsoft, are making that would be an impossibility for us to achieve with with the size engineering organization we have. So we have to really, before we go out building something, we do a lot of soul searching about what sort of exists already.
What's core to your business?
Yeah, exactly. And try to make use of those capabilities first, if we can, before we start venturing down a path of building our own.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really great advice. I know, on the Microsoft side, we're a little bit biased towards build versus buy, because that is what we do, for a living, is we build the platforms underneath. But you're right. I've seen a lot of customers make the mistake of building something that it's not really their core business, and it ends up taking a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it maybe isn't as good as and have some of the features that some of the other stuff does. So no, that's a great point for people to think about as they go through. Well, Ryan, again, always great to have you on. Like I said, I'm going to pencil you in about once a year at this
No,
point.
that'd be great.
And you can continue to update us on the journey. As always, thanks for coming on.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.